everyone, and welcome to our video on definitions and constructions of disability. Whilst it is possible to look up a basic definition of disability in a dictionary, when it comes to lived experience of disability and academic understandings of disability, the picture is more complex and more debated than that. There are two different models of disability. A model is just a term for a related set of ideas that help us understand how something works and relates to other things. This cartoon provides a really useful illustration of how the two models of disability work. The person is facing a challenge, and there are two ways to explain why the challenge is there. Saying the person's impairment is the problem is an example of what is called the medical model of disability. Saying the stairs are the problem that create an unnecessary barrier to the person being able to get where they want to go is an example of the social model. Here is a definition of each model for you to note down. Broadly speaking, the social model is the more accepted model in current times, but still not completely, and it still depends on the individual, the society, and the specific context. It's always important to look at things as historically and ideologically situated. Oliver argued that the capitalist system encourages the medical model. The capitalist system, which was critiqued by Marx and others who built on his work, sees the individual or the nuclear family as the most important unit in society. It is up to each individual to work to take care of themselves and their families, and being unable to do that is largely argued to be the individual's fault. Conservative governments hold a more ideologically capitalist view of things than other parties in the UK, though there are very few parties that are actually anti-capitalist in the UK. You might recognise the person in this image as Margaret Thatcher, a famous or infamous, depending on how you look at it, Conservative politician from the 1970s and 1980s. You can see how this well-known quote from her communicates a capitalist ideology. Can you also see how it could encourage a medical model of disability? If the focus of life is on the individual, then the focus of disability could be that it's a personal tragedy, or a personal challenge that the person needs to overcome by finding a way to fix their impairment. It's not that Margaret Thatcher or any other Conservative politician was or is proactively anti-disabled people. The argument simply is that in the system that her approach encouraged, life is harder for disabled people because the dominant view, or the dominant discourse if you like, is that they should solve their own problems and fix or cancel out any impairments they have. It is a valid argument that Oliver makes about the link between capitalism and the medical model. However, we still live in a capitalist system and the social model has become the dominant model. It is also the case that disabled people did not always have a good experience under some of the socialist governments that have existed in various societies. So what we're talking about here is a tendency towards a relationship between an ideology and a model, not an absolute cause and effect. As I said earlier, the social model is the most widely accepted and engaged with model these days. Let's watch a video from the charity Scope, in which various disabled people talk about what the social model of disability is and how it's changed their outlook in some cases. This is important because just like with the feminist movement or Black Lives Matter, anyone can be an ally of the movement, but the story should be told by the people who are living it.
I always felt being a disabled person was a problem. After learning about social model, it challenged me to look at disability completely differently. I myself was able to gain some confidence and self-esteem.
Social model basically says we are people with impairments, and those impairments clearly have an impact on how we live our lives. But the impairments are not the things which disable us.
I'm disabled by the world around me, and if the world was more accessible, I would be less disabled, and then I would just be left with my impairment, i.e. what doesn't work. It's not that my legs don't work that's disabling me. It's the fact that if I want to, if I'm on a flat surface, I can wheel around fine, I'm wonderfully happy. It's only when I come up to a flight of stairs.
As a wheelchair user, you have a slightly easier job of explaining the social model. Whereas if you're trying to explain the less physical barriers, it's much harder.
There's barriers everywhere in life to do with how we communicate, to do with people's attitudes.
Discovering the social model actually was a massive liberation on another level. Yeah, I was being treated differently, and no, it wasn't me being deficient, it was everybody else's social anxieties that were being projected onto me.
The blame for you not fitting in is no longer on your shoulders.
Suddenly, my disability is out there and not in here. It was what made me realise that I was something beyond the thing that other people thought I was.
It's a real liberating thing, but it also means you can change it. We can say to the world, look, you must put a lift in this building. You must make sure that the signage is readable for people with visual impairments.
If you want that equality to be real, you've really got to then tackle the inequality people are experiencing in schools, in workplaces, with transport.
The main reason that the social model, I think, is important to disabled people is that it allows us to be a community. You achieve a whole lot more as a group.
As long as we, as disabled people, make sure that our voices are heard and that all those people that support us also have their voices heard, I think we will get there.
I hope that Scope is doing work that will help disabled people to become prouder of who we are, pushing boundaries around who can be included and where.
Come the glorious day, if it ever came, where all the barriers went, we'd just be people with impairments. We wouldn't be disabled people anymore.
This is Tom Shakespeare, an academic who writes on disability and himself has the condition achondroplasia. As you can see here, he asks us not to simply leave the medical model behind and use only the social model. Shakespeare argues that the social model is a step forward, but that it sees all disabled people as a homogeneous group, which they are not. He says the model disallows discussion of real pain and individual experiences of impairment, which are important for people to own and be able to process and express. He also argues that the social model disallows discussion of areas of private life, such as sexuality, for disabled people. He also says that there is a tendency for the social model to gloss over cultural issues and images, making it all about the physical environment. As we know from everything we've been exploring on this module, words and images are hugely important, and we can argue that they have very real implications for people's lived experience. It's important, therefore, to make sure we see the complexity and nuance and not simplify things too much. In the light of Tom Shakespeare's point about not placing too much focus on the physical environment, I'd like you to do a short task. Here it is. Pause the video here and note down some thoughts about the appropriateness of the symbol we often see used to represent disability. So, how did you get on? What do you think? The use of a wheelchair is, of course, a very important reminder of the physical barriers that are faced by a great many people with disabilities that mean buildings provide them with mobility difficulties. However, it doesn't capture anyone who is disabled in a different way, by a mental health condition, a chronic health condition, neurodiversity, and so on. Perhaps it is time to rethink the symbol used for disability. If it were up to you, what would you use? Now that we've been thinking a bit about the very wide range of disabilities that there are, let's think about disability and identity. Who should do the defining of who is disabled? For example, if I asked you if deaf people are disabled, what would you say? Most people would say yes, deaf people are disabled. And some deaf people themselves would also say, yes, we are disabled. But a significant number of deaf people, particularly those who are active in the deaf community, do not see themselves as disabled. They argue that their difference is a cultural one, and in particular a language one. Deaf people have a unique culture, and any deaf person who signs is using a different language from the hearing people around them. Sign languages are just as complex and fully communicative as spoken languages. So you can see that it would be a fair argument to ask why that difference should be seen any differently from a person who speaks a language not native to the context they're in and who doesn't speak the main language of the context they're in. That person would need and deserve an interpreter to enable them to engage in society. The same can be said for a deaf person. Provide them with a service provider who knows their language or an interpreter who can interpret to and from their language, and they are enabled in the same way. It's a very interesting debate and one you might want to look into further. Another example is a guy I know who has the same condition as Tom Shakespeare, yet doesn't consider himself disabled. He chooses to do everything he can to make the things in society work for him, and to take responsibility himself for doing that. And who am I or anyone else to tell him his analysis of his own situation is wrong? Can you see the parallels between this discussion and other discussions we've had about structure and agency? This friend of mine chooses not to look at things structurally and say that everyone who has achondroplasia is disabled by society. Instead, he chooses to use his own agency to define himself as non-disabled. It's important to recognise this diversity in how people self-identify, and this is one of the reasons why, when filling out forms and so on in current times, you will usually be asked not "Are you disabled?" but "Do you consider yourself to be disabled?" or "Do you consider yourself to have a disability?" I'd like you to do a task now around how disability is expressed in language. I'm going to show you a list of words that are used in relation to disability, and I want you to decide whether each of them is okay to use or not. If you think they're not, decide what you would replace them with. Pause the video here and do the task. I'm going to speak a lot about the analysis of this in the remainder of this video, so I really do encourage you to spend a bit of time thinking about this so that you get the most out of the rest of the video. So, how did you get on? Let's talk through the various words and think about any issues with them. While we're doing this, we'll think too about what precisely it is about the language, the way the word works and what it expresses, that is the issue. Let's take the first set of words first. Handicapped person, disabled person, differently abled person, and person with a disability. Handicapped person is very dated, and my guess is that you thought that term was not okay. It was used a lot when I was young, but is not so much used now. That is not surprising when we think about it in the context of the medical model of disability and the social model of disability. To talk about a person being handicapped is to say that they have a condition that handicaps them. It makes it an individual thing, that it is the person's body or mind that is the problem for them, which places the word clearly in the medical model camp. Disabled person, on the other hand, sits very much in the social model camp. The way it works grammatically is to express that there is something else doing the disabling, that the person is disabled by something outside of them, rather than by something intrinsic to them. What about the other two words? You maybe thought differently abled was an okay term because it has more positive connotations and represents disabled people as being equal to non-disabled people, just different from them. Indeed, this phrase was very popular for a time a few decades ago, precisely due to that analysis. However, It is considered by some to actually try so hard to not be offensive and to be inclusive that it loses sight entirely of the disability. If you think about it, no two people have exactly the same abilities. We can therefore say that absolutely everyone is differently abled from everybody else, whether they are disabled or whether they are non-disabled. Those who favour a social model would say that we don't want to lose sight of the disability like that and cancel out that aspect of a person's identity. And if we only focus on ability, we lose sight too of the ways in which society disables people. What about person with a disability? This phrase is quite popular too, and some argue that it is a better phrase to use than disabled person because it kind of distances the disability from the person, making it less central to their identity. Did you think something similar or not? Most disability campaigners and people who hold very strongly to the social model of disability would actually say that using person with a disability is less empowering than using the words disabled person. We have previously discussed how the way disabled person is grammatically constructed expresses that something outside of the person is disabling them. So, to distance that from the person by using person with a disability actually begins to lose sight of the ways in which society is disabling the person. Phew! Who knew there would be so much to say about things that on the surface look like pretty minor differences? Why not pause for a moment and think about whether any of your opinions have changed between noting down what you initially thought and now you've listened to me analyse the different words and phrases. Think also about whether any of your opinions on any of the other words and phrases might also change due to this. Let's think now about person confined to a wheelchair and person in a wheelchair. It's pretty clear to see that person confined to a wheelchair is the more negative of the two terms, isn't it? The word confining has negative connotations of restriction and even imprisonment. But does person in a wheelchair go far enough away from that negative representation? If you think about it, person in a wheelchair represents the person as passive, as not doing anything except sitting in the wheelchair. The wheelchair seems highlighted more than the person. So what alternative could we use? A popular term these days is wheelchair user. Can you see that whereas person in a wheelchair represents the person as passive, wheelchair user represents them as active? They are doing something. They are using the wheelchair as a useful resource to enable them to do the things they want to do. That having been said, it's not as simple as presuming that the words with positive connotations or the active words are the best words. I did this task with a class once in which one of the students was a wheelchair user, and he said that he referred to himself as in a wheelchair and didn't have any difficulty with doing so. He'd never really thought about saying wheelchair user, and he thought the discussion was an interesting one, but whether he ever changed his terminology, I don't know. This is an important reminder that the disabled person themselves should do the defining. Now let's think about spastic and person who suffers from cerebral palsy. A bit like with handicapped person, I'm pretty sure that you will have said that using the word spastic is not okay. It was very commonly used for people with cerebral palsy when I was young. Indeed, there was even a charity that proactively called itself the Spastic Society. But in time, society accepted that this was not an enabling word to use. One reason was that it had come to be a term of abuse used by children in the playground. More than that though, if we think about what it actually means, we can see that it is quite disabling. It refers to the way a person with cerebral palsy's muscles spasm, or why they do so. So to use the term spastic is to refer to the person as a particular characteristic of their muscles, not as a person with a full and complex identity. So what about person who suffers from cerebral palsy? Did you think that terminology was okay? We see it quite commonly used along with a whole range of different conditions. We can pretty safely say it's better than saying spastic, but think about the word suffers. Think about the connotations it has. It has very negative connotations that suggest that the whole experience of the person with this condition is negative. No doubt some of the experience is painful and difficult, but not all of it is. So instead of saying that a person suffers with a condition, it is much more enabling to simply say that they have a condition or that they live with a condition. Now let's consider the deaf and the blind. What did you say about those? In these terms, the disability is a noun. Talking about people as their disability like that represents their identity as all about their disability and as only about their disability, with no room for anything else. Instead, it is more enabling and more common today to say deaf people and blind people. In these terms, deaf and blind are adjectives describing words, not nouns. They describe the person as deaf or blind, but using the noun person rather than making the disability the noun allows for the fact that the person has a great many aspects to their identity, not just their disability. Finally, let's think about autistic person, person with autism, and neurodiverse person. What did you think about those? Perhaps you thought they shouldn't even be considered in a video about disability terminology. Indeed, some autistic people do not consider themselves disabled. Some do. As with achondroplasia and Tom Shakespeare and my friend, people's own identifications vary. But I've included the terminology here because some autistic people do consider themselves disabled. None of these are particularly problematic in the way that some of the other terminology has been. They don't use an offensive term and they don't define the person by the disability by saying an autistic, where autistic is a noun. But there are still nuanced differences between them that are important to consider. If we compare this set of words to the set of words about cerebral palsy, we might suggest that person with autism is more empowering to use than autistic person, in the same way as we said that person with cerebral palsy is a relatively more empowering usage for that group of words. It's not that simple though. One size does not fit all. And just as Tom Shakespeare advised us, we must not consider disabled people to be a homogeneous group, where the nature of the disability and the way the disability affects the person are the same in every case. Some autistic people themselves argue that saying person with autism is disempowering compared with autistic person, and simply doesn't define them properly. Their argument is that because autism is a neurological condition, it affects all of them. It is not like having a physical disability that affects one limb, say. They say everything about them is autistic, and to say they are with autism undermines that. So what about neurodiverse person? Perhaps you thought it was the most appropriate of the three. It is certainly often used in current times. However, neurodiversity encompasses a range of conditions, not just autism. So an autistic person can be described as neurodiverse, but they might also see that terminology as diluting the representation of the actual condition they have. Here's a brief summary of what the main issues have been and what I've talked around here. Why not pause the video and note them down? There really is an awful lot to talk about before we even start talking about disability, as we think about what terminology to even use to represent the diversity of disabilities. I hope this discussion has been useful to help you think about what some of the issues are around the word choices we make. It's important to remember, though, that there isn't a right answer as such. Just like with my student who described himself as in a wheelchair when I would describe him as a wheelchair user, there is a debate about this terminology. And beyond that, each person should be empowered to choose the best way to represent the disabled part of their identity. I hope you've enjoyed exploring definitions and constructions of disability with me. See you in the next video.